Now, we're shaped by ideas, whether we're aware of them or not. And our culture owes an enormous debt to the Romantic period. I'll give you an example. If you walk into the streets of Cambridge, your overriding impression will be that of medieval buildings. And yet, most of those medieval buildings you will encounter are in fact products of Romanticism. So that's an instance, I think, of the way in which the very shape and structure of our environment has been deeply influenced by the Romantic tradition, by that Victorian Gothic. So too other factors. I might mention the revival of Shakespeare, wild gardens, or Chinese towers. You could also mention nationalism, folk traditions, or even ideas of personal fulfillment and conceptions of the artist. There are all kinds of ways in which Romanticism has deeply influenced our culture today. So obviously, Romanticism is very important, but it's also a period which is not terribly fashionable in contemporary intellectual culture. So to disparage a thinker as a romantic is a very effective form of polemic. And in fact, one might note here the curious status of figures like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who were clearly late romantics, Christian romantics, but romantics all the same, and that they inhabit a curious realm of being both enormously powerful and successful writers, and yet regarded with a curious disdain by many sophisticated critics of that sort of late Romanticism. So I think our relationship to the Romantic inheritance is a rather ambivalent one. On the one hand, we recognize that this is enormously important, and yet on the other hand, it wasn't so long ago before the Victorian society became particularly powerful that we were very keen to knock down Victorian buildings and intellectually rid ourselves of the Victorian and Romantic legacy. Okay, so how do I define Romanticism? Well, I'm thinking of Romanticism basically in terms of the period about 1770 to about 1870. And of course, the key event is that of the French Revolution, 1789. Bliss it was, that dawn to be alive. So very typically, the Romantics were enthusiastic supporters of the ideals of the French Revolution. But Wordsworth, from whom we have those very words about the experience of the French Revolution, was also haunted for the rest of his life by nightmares of the terror, because Wordsworth lived in France in that very turbulent period. And this shift from an early enthusiasm for the French Revolution and then the disgust and shock at the terror is, I think, very indicative of a strand in Romanticism. And this relates not just to the French Revolution, but to the Enlightenment legacy more broadly. So characteristically, the great Romantic thinkers, and in the British context I'm thinking particularly of S.T. Coleridge, to whom I'll come in a moment, these are figures who all knew the Enlightenment tradition. They had all become figures within it. The young S.T. Coleridge was an enthusiastic Unitarian. Unitarian was a classic form of Enlightenment Christianity. So the Romantics, characteristically, were figures, thinkers, who understood the force of the Enlightenment position, and their critique of Enlightenment thought was based on a deep sense of its power. So I think when we're looking at the Romantics, we have to bear in mind that they are not rejecting the Enlightenment critique tout court. What they are trying to do, at their best, is to retrieve what the Enlightenment legacy had occluded or obscured. And yet, very often, if you look at them more carefully, they are also prepared to concede a certain justification to those critiques in the Enlightenment. Classic example there would be Coleridge and his attitude to higher criticism. So Coleridge, on the one hand, accepts the Enlightenment critique of strict literalism. On the other hand, he insists that a Christian theologian has to understand Scripture as being divinely inspired in some sense, if not in terms of verbal inspiration. That is a typical Romantic move to want to retrieve what the Enlightenment, through its often rather savage critique, had seemed to have thrown away, and yet to do this with a certain degree of intellectual rigor and authenticity. In Britain, we tend to associate the great ages of thought with the 17th and 18th centuries, and then again with the 20th century. So the 19th century to us often seems like an age of poets or novelists, but not an age of great philosophers. And this is very misleading, I think, because figures like Coleridge were asking extremely profound questions. What is the basis of human society? Is it contract? Now, the Enlightenment answer to that question was indeed just that. Human society is based on contract. Well, the Romantics questioned that, and they, in Coleridge's case, drawing on Burke, argued that contract presupposes much deeper bonds. You can only have a proper contract in society if there is already tacit agreement between the members of those society, and that those bonds are not conscious bonds. They are bonds between the dead, the unborn, and the living. So in this sense, in opposition to this purely contractual, individualistic, and atomistic model of society that was so prevalent in the Enlightenment, the Romantics were trying to draw on a more organic conception of society, were trying to revisit the very idea of tradition. In fact, arguing, as Coleridge does, that change and progression in society will only function on the basis of tradition. It's only a society that is able to develop organically that is able to properly form serious contracts, and contracts that will sustain and be able to sustain proper agreement. So in the Romantic period, we find some fairly radical and searching criticisms of the Enlightenment legacy. Also in the scientific realm, the Romantics were very often worried about the limits of the new mechanical science. So figures like Coleridge didn't want to dispose of the scientific attitude towards the world. Coleridge himself had very close relations with leading scientists of the day. The question that Coleridge was raising was about the limits of mechanical explanation. Is it the case that, through purely mechanistic explanations, that we can do justice to our experience of, for example, human freedom? Can we do justice to our experience of beauty? how can we understand the beauty of the world if we're just looking at the push and shove of mechanical items within that world? So the question that a great romantic thinker like Coleridge is posing is not the rejection of science, as it were, but rather a question about the proper limits of science. Can the natural sciences explain everything that there is, or are there domains of knowledge that are genuine knowledge and yet are not subject to the scrutiny of the laboratory? Are there areas where the techniques of the laboratory are simply inappropriate? Coleridge uses a nice image of someone who is sniffing a painting of Titian. And that image of the connoisseur trying to judge the painting of Titian by sniffing at it is an image of using the wrong criteria with which to judge the world. And a great romantic thinker like Coleridge is arguing that the experimental sciences are, of course, enormously important and enormously valuable in enhancing our understanding of the physical world. What they cannot offer is an exhaustive account of that reality. And for some aspects of our encounter with the world, we are in a much better position if we do not limit ourselves to the techniques of the hard or the natural sciences.